We're on to our last 6 Proverbs today, and I've done 6 instead of 5 as I've done for the rest just because there's 31s, there's an odd one. And I've also got ambitious and tried to throw the summary for the whole book into one. So this sort of requires that we're going to whiz through these last 6. So Proverb 26, overall it's very damning of fools, and particularly the idea of employing one, whether in a professional capacity or in a, just generally relying on fools. It also warns quite a bit against gossip, both being the gossip and being surrounded by anyone who does a lot of gossiping. It talks about enemies disguising themselves with appropriate words, but their hearts are filled with 7 abominations. Not quite sure what those 7 abominations are. Potentially the 7 things that God hates and one extra that he detests from Proverbs 6, I think it was. I'm not quite sure if it's that, or it could be the 7 deadly sins, I suppose. Because I think so I understand the 7 deadly sins aren't actually in the Bible; they were brought about later on, or something like, or defined later on. It talks about whoever digs a pit will fall into it. I kind of like that idea. I've long said, I think I've said it in some other videos before, the idea of some people's crime is also their punishment. If someone's an idiot on the road, it seems it could be more of a symptom of them having a terrible life, which would seem to be their punishment being borne out. Does that sort of reflect that idea? You dig a pit and you fall into it yourself, suggesting that you're digging the pit to capture someone else? I don't know, something like that maybe. Proverb 27, we've got basically talking about just don't boast, which is very interesting because you meet people who tell you how great they are, and it's like people who are great don't tell you how great they are. That's a big idea and one I find quite fascinating, but we haven't got time to dig into it today. I'm sure it will come up again. Another idea, a quote from them is, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. I really like that. That's that idea of you get the right people around you and you can bounce off each other and make each other better, I guess. It seems to be obviously true, and I guess that's that idea that you want to be careful who you surround yourself with and people who make you better rather than make you worse. One's life reflects the heart. That's that sort of idea of as within, so without, I guess, and vice versa to some extent. So, obviously there's some great people having a terrible life on the outward, but how they conduct themselves in that life is surely still going to reflect a decent person. So I quite like that. We also have human eyes are never satisfied, which was something I was going to put into the second anniversary video, but I was running out of time. This idea that we are sort of insatiable as humans. It doesn't matter what we get, we just cannot be satisfied, and you get something great and you want the next thing, and then something else you want the next thing. And then I wonder if that's some of the problem for celebrities to some extent. They achieve basically everything you can achieve and then run out of anywhere else to go, and it's whether that's particularly conducive to a good life, I don't know. Proverb number 28, basically don't be horrible. So that's a nice easy one. I'm say shortening these to fit in the summary. 29, no real theme, but talks a lot about discipline and consequences of punkery. So they're all a lot like that, but this one was, if you're going to pick a summary for it. Talk about a saying of Agur, A-G-U-R. I can't remember who that is. I think someone relatively minor. Don't know. Have to look that up. It's a kind of a poem summarising a range of good things and bad things, but all seem broadly sensible. So yeah, fine. Okay, go. And we have this King Lemuel for Proverb 31. And he was taught this by his mother. I can't remember who he is either, because he's not one of the kings of Israel or Judah. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it just sort of makes some generic points that are reasonably fair, and then finishes on a big thing about the virtues of having a good wife. So it goes a bit different at the end there, in terms of tone. But overall, it's still this, you see how it's called wisdom literature, certainly. So, in terms of a summary of the overall book of Proverbs, is it fair to say this has been my favourite one? Because Genesis answers some really big, massive life questions in theological terms, at least. It confirms that suffering would make sense from the book of Genesis. But it's not much fun to read, or rather it's quite difficult to read. Proverbs, it's amazing how it translates into modern terms. This stuff is like 2,500, 3,000 years, well, whatever. Still a lot of it applicable today. One of the themes is discipline. It keeps coming out through Proverbs. And I quite like that. That seems to make a lot of sense. And I think there's not been a great deal of that in the Bible thus far. So that does seem, Solomon, you okay? That seems pretty wise. There is a difficulty, of course, with that, in the sense that if you're going to have discipline to be good at what you do and, good person, that then ties back to the responsibility problem I've mentioned before, where it seems that if you do good, then it's because of God, so you don't get to take any credit for it. And if you do bad, you get punished for it. So there's this lopsided responsibility equation. I assume I have that wrong, because that just wouldn't seem to make much sense. But that does, at this point, seems to be what that is saying. We've also, of course, solved the fear of the Lord problem. All through the Old Testament, we've been having fear of your God, fear the Lord. And that idea of fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we finally solved that with the book of Proverbs, thankfully, telling us that fear of the Lord just means humility. So suddenly that all makes a lot more sense. I guess in that it ties up to, because there's quite a lot in Proverbs about haughty eyes are bad and arrogance and thinking you know best and deciding how you're going to do things without any reference to God. And that ties up nicely with the humility as well. So, yeah, I think it's nice when bits pull together. There's a line here that seems to reflect that people believe that there's some sort of afterlife. But as I've said before, I don't understand where that came from. So obviously this is Solomon writing, so he's got it from somewhere, or he's made it up. But it does seem, from the Psalms as well, it does seem that people, society in general, a sort of snapshot of society and of Solomon, it's not particularly overt or clear, but it does seem that's what they seem to be getting at. And I just don't understand where that's come from. We've come across the tree of life for the first time since Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, I think. All we seem to have really established here that it's not a tree, because this and such thing is a tree of life. Okay, so it's not actually a tree, so not a tree of life, or rather the tree of life is not a tree. Which seems to help with the whole idea that the story of Adam and Eve is not literally true, because that had a tree of life in it, but it was supposed to be a tree. But a tree of life isn't a tree. Maybe a tree can be a tree of life as well. It's very confusing, but that all seems to work out okay, but we still don't know what a tree of life is. Or we know some things that are a tree of life, but what does that mean? Don't know. As I said in the anniversary video recently, my thinking on what sin is has shifted quite a bit. And I think a lot of that has come from Proverbs. I mean, a lot of it links back to David, in terms of pretty terrible person, got people killed to steal wife. I mean, only once, but that's pretty bad, isn't it? Let's be honest. And we find that he's clearly God's favourite to some significant extent. So it didn't matter what the behaviour was. Or rather, it did matter what the behaviour was, but that wasn't what defined him. The devotion to God is what seemed to define him. It does, though, raise the problem that we need to have some sort of definition of wickedness and righteousness. So suddenly that's become less clear. Sin was naughty deeds, but David can kill someone so he can nick his wife, and that's the deed isn't okay, but David's okay. So what defines someone who is wicked versus someone who is righteous? And thus far I'm not quite clear on that, so that's something to keep working on. We have mentioned that prayer from the upright pleases God, and as I mentioned before, this prayer idea I find really difficult, because you ask God for something. Christians will tell you that sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. It's okay, so why did you pray in the first place? And are you really persuading God? I mean, we had an incident back in Exodus, I think it was, when Moses persuaded God, certainly around Moses' time, that Moses persuaded God to change his mind, or it was written as if that was what would have happened. It seems unlikely that God would have had his mind changed. It seems more likely that, I don't know, perhaps that's an example, so God just wanted Moses to ask. And maybe that's the key to prayer, I guess. I've got a lot of wrangling to do with that, because it does seem people are asking for stuff, and it's not for themselves, but asking for stuff for other people. But would God not do that if he wanted to? And is he gonna make a difference because you asked? I don't know. I think prayer is much more complicated than it would seem. We've had further ideas developing about this whole idea that sacrifice is disappearing, whereas the Old Testament, well, this is the Old Testament, but earlier in the Old Testament, a lot of sacrificing has to happen. And now we've had David's contrite heart is enough sacrifice, and now we've got this idea that you can attain atonement through love and faithfulness, which sort of sidelines sacrifice a bit more. So it's clearly still there, but it does seem to be drifting off a little bit to some extent. The book is very hard on fools. They don't come off very well at all. But it's interestingly, you'd think a fool is someone who needs help. but it does seem to suggest that you're not supposed to help them because it's a waste of your time and there's no point and they could drag you down. But I guess we have a fairly difficult idea of what exactly a fool is, and there's talk earlier about it's simple people and that, but there's a lot of simple people who might do foolish things, but they're not bad people. So, if you're not supposed to help them, it almost seems like politically it would be convenient to not have to help some people, so you get something, you don't have to do it. I'm like, oh, great, brilliant. I don't know if it necessarily holds water, but it's difficult, because mostly when someone's a fool, at their core, it's probably not their fault, I don't think. You get smart people who just haven't thought about stuff and do foolish things. I've done some of those myself. And we have to take responsibility for those, with the weird responsibility equation. But yeah, a fool at heart, it's a different one. We'll have to explore further. And then we also have there's a lot of criticism of the wealthy, but it's coming from King Solomon, who is a king and therefore pretty wealthy. So it's difficult to tell, is it being wealthy that's the problem or pursuing wealth that's the problem? Because King Solomon obviously born into that, so he didn't go after the wealth. And when God asked him what he wanted, it wasn't wealth, it was wisdom, so he could better serve his people. So his aim there seemed to be very good, even if he then got 1,000 wives. But yeah, this relationship between wealth and biblical righteousness is a complicated one. And then last but not least, I can't remember if I said it earlier, but I think I did, but gossip is bad. So that's been a theme throughout Proverbs, that gossiping people is bad, contributing to gossip, listening to gossip, all bad. But yeah, so that was definitely one of my favourite books of the Bible so far. It's really readable. I think if someone was going to try the Old Testament, a great place to start might be Proverbs, because it's not too weird. Or it is weird, but I guess it's relatively less weird. But yeah, so next we're going to go on to the book of Ecclesiastes and figure out what that word means and what an ecclesiastes is.